Hello, everybody. My name is Pam. I'm a board game designer and the founder of ProtoTO. I'm so glad you could all be here today. I'm looking forward to spending the weekend with all of you. If you have any questions throughout the weekend, feel free to ask me or anyone wearing a ProtoTO t-shirt. We'll be happy to help. So before I introduce Scott, I just want to make a couple quick announcements. So the designers, you should have received 3 game cards. So if you can fill those out with the info about each game you want to test during the sessions. During the showcase tonight, following Scott's talk, you're going to have those cards out on your table so playtesters can sign up to play your game throughout the weekend. So if you can have that info ready to go for after Scott's talk, that would be great. So playtesters, during the showcase, you can walk around, see all the different games that are going to be tested throughout the weekend, and sign up for the ones that interest you. So I want to thank our sponsor, Board Again Games. If you don't know, they are in this area here with the Board Again Bar and Gaming Lounge. And they're selling beer right now. You can have a beer. There you go. They're in there doing awesome stuff. They have a great setup in there. They have a ton of games you can take out during open gaming. So I definitely check them out. So I just want to say that I'm really proud to work with Board Again. They're really focused on making board game an inclusive community, and that's really important to me. So I hope you all feel as welcome here at ProtoTO as I do at any Board Again event. So I also want to acknowledge ProtoTO's partners, Breakout and Fan Expo. I think some of you are here tonight. Both of those organizations have really supported ProtoTO, and I really appreciate their support. And I also want to thank all the sponsors who donated. There's so many amazing prizes for the raffle. There's a great raffle going on there. So there's 4 different draws. So the first one is tomorrow morning, then there's Saturday night, Sunday morning, and Sunday night. So just make sure you know which draw you're putting your ticket into. One last thing is your name tag is your proof of payment. So keep that on throughout the weekend. It's also a great way to learn each other's names and get to know each other better. Okay, that is it for me. So I'm going to introduce Scott now. I'm so happy that Scott is kicking off ProtoTO with his talk, Making Games to Change the World. So Dr. Nicholson is the director of the Brantford Games Network and the Game Design and Development Program at Wilfrid Laurier University. He was the host of Board Games with Scott, which was the first board game series on YouTube. He's the designer of Tulipmania 1637 and Going, Going, Gone. His research focuses on using live-action games such as escape rooms and simulations for education and training. So please join me in welcoming Scott.
Do I need the mic? Oh, no, I have a mic. There we go. Hello. Hi there, everyone. Hi. So I am Scott Nicholson, and I'm going to be talking with you for the next hour or so about something I've become very passionate about over the years, and that's making games to change the world. One thing I'll throw out right now, if you're on Twitter, or even if you're not, and you want to get the handout, so in order to save paper, because we actually make climate change games, I've put the handout online. So if you want to go to twitter.com/snicholson, that will take you to my Twitter account. The tweet I just posted has a link to the Google document, which is the handout, which has some notes from tonight's talk. And we're actually, as I'm going through, you might find those useful to have if you want to grab them. So again, that's at Twitter over at @snicholson if you want to grab the handout for tonight's talk. So yes, I'm a professor here. I've been here in Canada I'm in my 3rd year. I was at Syracuse University for 15 years. My background of first degree was in math and computers. Then I got tired of my hobby being my job, so I became a librarian and worked as a librarian for a while. I decided I wanted to teach people how to be librarians, so I got my PhD in information science and went to Syracuse University, where I was the director of the library school. In about 2007, I saw that libraries were using games. And I said, well, that's interesting. I know a lot about games. I've been a lifelong gamer. I've gamed all sorts of platforms. I've been involved with live-action games and video games. I was in line this morning at Walmart to get the SNES Classic System because I'm like, that's part of my childhood. Was anyone else out for that? Did anyone get one? So I did get one. So there you go. And I played it for a while. And I'm like, these games are hard. But anyway, but in about 2007, I saw how libraries were using games, and that got me really interested to say, maybe we can do something more with games than just use them for recreation. So As was mentioned, I created Board Games with Scott. There's a number of people that probably have seen that before. This is me in a very younger time, without so much, white, but sometimes color in my beard. I started that in 2005. 12 years ago, I did board games with Scott. And during those 5 years where I was doing videos about board games, it was really nice. I got a chance to talk with a lot of people about board games, get people excited about them. I've had a lot of people ask after I stopped in 2010, and they said, well, where'd you go? You just disappeared. I'm like, well, I didn't disappear. I just kind of refocused a little bit. I got passionate about actually using games in ways to make a difference out there. And my hope tonight in this talk is to show you how we've been making some games that change the world already, how you may have already done that in the games you're making, and open some doors for you as designers as to places where you could take your skills of making games and actually use them in ways that change the world. And hopefully by the end of tonight's talk, you will have some new thoughts about possible markets where you could take your game ideas outside of the recreational world and out there into that space of education. I also helped start the On Board Games podcast, so I've been heavily involved in social media, and that's something else I'll encourage you to do, that if you want to share your message, start something on social media, begin engaging with people, because it can open a lot of interesting doors. So yeah, my board games, Tulipmania 1637, which came out 2009 by JKLM Games, which was a bubble market, stock market game. I was actually in Amsterdam after Essen. Essen is a big board game fair in Germany. If you've never been, you should take the pilgrimage at least once to Essen, Germany in October to go see how many thousand new games are coming out. But I went to the Tulip Museum, and the bottom floor was all about Tulipmania, which was the first big bubble market. So by the end of that, tulip bulbs were going about the price of a house. And I thought, hey, that's interesting. There's no games that are really about a bubble market. So I set out to study, well, how does a bubble market happen, and made Tulipmania. Ironically, the publisher went bankrupt before I got a royalty check. The second game I had was Going, Going, Gone, which was an auction game that was put out by Stronghold Games. And this game I actually created because I was helping libraries bring in games, but so many games that were in libraries were hard to teach. They had rule books to deal with. They didn't look fun. Have you ever watched yourself when you're playing our games? A lot of them, we don't look like we're having fun. We look like we're constipated, and in pain, if you look at these pictures. So I said, I want a game that looks like you're having fun, that's noisy, because in a library, you wanted people to come over and say, oh, what's going on? So I wanted a game that would draw people over and get engaged, and that's the inspiration behind that game. There we go. So I run the Brantford Games Network, or the BGNlab. I know I have some of our students that are here tonight that have come to previous ProtoTOs. And so our students are in a 4-year Bachelor of Fine and Applied Arts degree where they're doing game design. It's not a programming degree, it's not an art degree, it's a game design degree. The first year is all just analog games and game theory and things like that. They then learn some programming and learn some making mobile stuff. But in their 4th year, they partner up with an organization and make a game to change the world. But they're doing a lot of stuff very much like what is going on here. That's what we do regularly in our lab. And actually, over on that promo table, if you want to, there's little handouts like this that talk about the program. So if you know someone that's looking to go into an undergrad program and you want to nudge them our way to have them come study with me for 4 years, you can grab one of those things and pass them along. That's enough for the promotion for tonight. So what am I going to talk about tonight? 4 big topics. First, the terms gamification and game-based learning. And one of my goals tonight is to have you use these terms correctly, because it drives me nuts to hear these terms used incorrectly. I want to teach you what these words mean so that you can use the words correctly for what it is you're doing. I'm going to talk about opportunities for having games with real-world outcomes, where we already see that. I'm going to talk about some of the differences between designing a serious game and a recreational game. And finally, with whatever time we have left, we're going to do a little brief activity where you're actually going to think about some ideas of how you could take your concepts in game design and bring it over into game-based learning. So gamification. How many of you have heard the term gamification? How many of you are sick of hearing the term gamification? It's a term that we started to see around 2010, and it hit a few years before that. And it came to be known as this world of badges, points, levels. Ah, they caught me! Wait, sorry. They're taking me back to the US. No! Come on. There. So, gamification, this is what I call my BLAP gamification process. BLAP stands for badges, levels, and leaderboards, achievements, and points. So the idea, I'm going to make you all gamification professionals right now. You ready? You can put that on your business card. You can go and charge $500 an hour to consult with companies to bring gamification to them. The power of gamification lies within you. So the idea is you take something you want to get people to do, and you give them points for it. Points are how we control players. That's actually a perception that people getting into gamification believe that all games are about earning points, and many of them are. But if you think about we as game designers, one of the ways that we control players and get them to do stuff is by offering them points. So with gamification, you're like, okay, let's take this something in the real world, and let's give them points for it. Now, points are fine, and that's interesting for a little while, but it gets hard to track all of those points, so you need some way to figure out how do your points matter. One way is through leaderboards. So leaderboards, it's where you have a leaderboard and you see how many points you have and you see how many points everyone else has, and in theory, that's supposed to motivate you to want to do better. The reality is leaderboards do two things. They make you hate the people above you, and the people below you hate you. And that's what a leaderboard does. So I hate you and you hate me. Yeah, let's use a leaderboard. But in certain opportunities where you're dealing with people that are already competitive, leaderboards can help them amp up that competition. I tried using leaderboards in my classes. I actually tested gamification for education. And what I found is that leaderboards, the strong students still did really well. The middle students and the weak students plummeted. Because what they saw is as those strong students took off, those other students looked and said, well, we have no chance of catching them. Why should we even try? And so I actually have a research paper where I talk through what happened over weeks, week by week, tracking the scores and watching as students that were already not interested became less interested, and students that might have been interested became less interested, and the stronger students, who were going to do well anyway, were still motivated. So you have to be careful with that. Levels is another way of dealing with this. So you have, let's say, 1 to 100 points, and you're level 1, and 200 to 300 points, and you're level 2, and 3 to 500 points, and you're level 3, and etc. Levels are an easy way to help take those blobs of points and turn them into a way to see how you're doing in the game itself. Achievements are where you add additional things you want to motivate someone to do. So let's say I was putting gamification on getting you to recycle, and every time you recycled something, you got some points. And the more you recycled, the more points you got. But I decided to make it interesting, and I said, all right, if you sort things, you're going to get an achievement. You're going to be the super sorter. And so it's a way to get people to do something outside of the normal path and explore some interesting spaces. And badges are the public display of any of this. So badges are this idea of you have a profile, then you have a badge, and it says, I'm a super sorter, and you can tell everyone this. And there you go. You have everything you need for BLAP gamification. And the reason why I call it BLAP is because what you do is you take something in the real world, you take this bunch of gamification, you drop it on top of the thing, it sounds like this, BLAP, and there you go, instant motivation. Or maybe not. So one of the things I started studying this, in 2012, I got interested in what was going on with rewards and what was happening with these systems. This is this concept of a Skinner box, which looks an awful lot like a slot machine. And so the idea is that you push this little lever and food comes out sometimes. And what they're testing is how often will you push this lever and food doesn't continue to come out. And they're figuring out how do you motivate people. And they can also play and they can electrify the floor under you. And so you can push the lever to avoid being electrocuted. And so they use these to test with rats how long a rat would do something without being rewarded or punished. And by the way, rewards and punishments are the same thing, just opposite sides. So absence of a reward is a punishment. So the effects that either have these same sort of effects. But the idea of creating these things in the real world to get you to lose weight, to get you to recycle, to get you to make a behavioral change, we saw a lot of systems that do this. And I got concerned about that. I said, there's got to be a problem. So I started studying this, and I found this book, Gamification by Design, which had this quote, once you start giving someone a reward, you have to keep her in that reward loop forever. I said, huh. Now, I was working with libraries at this time, and libraries were starting to talk about how wonderful gamification is, how it got people engaged and got people reading lots and lots of books. But I saw this and said, when the person who says, I'm going to do gamification, now is saying, hey, you can have this reward, but you got to be rewarding people forever. I'm like, well, that sounds like something that as a gamification consultant you'd want people to do. But as someone that's actually trying to change the world, I'm a little concerned about this. So I read these two books, and there's also, this book really changed my life, Punished by Rewards. It got me thinking about how we have screwed up trying to motivate people by giving them rewards. Daniel Pink's Drive is more of a business approach to this. There's actually a really nice 10-minute TED Talk that's out there and an animated talk by Daniel Pink. So if you want to learn a little bit more about what's going on about this concept, the idea is that if you reward someone to do something, then whatever motivation they may have had before, you give them a reward, and that reward eats away at that motivation they had. So librarians say, hey, you like reading books, we're going to reward you for reading books, which is great. and you'll read books in the short term, but then when the reward goes away, you now have eroded whatever desire you had before to want to read books. In fact, in this, the Punish by Reward books, what they say is that libraries that encourage kids over the summer to read lots of books to get pizza will end up with fat kids that don't want to read. As an example, you can look to see what we've done in our educational system. When we offer kids grades and we try to motivate them to learn by giving them grades. Before kids go to school, they want to learn about everything. But then you start giving them rewards for learning. And then any of you that are teachers know, by the time you get kids after 5 years, 10 years, 20 years in the system, they don't want to do anything unless they get a grade for it. Because we've broken our kids. We've taken out that intrinsic motivation to learn. And so this concerned me a lot. So I got involved in something else called meaningful gamification. And this is another article you can find if you want to learn about it, my recipe for meaningful gamification. So I started studying play. I said, if we don't want to use rewards, what else can we use? I said, we could use concepts from play. Because really a game, one definition of game is a form of play with goals and structure. So if you take and subtract play from both sides, then you've got that what's left over to do gamification without play is just goals and structure. And that doesn't sound very much fun. So I said, what if we focus on the play? So I came up with 6 things that you could use to actually build intrinsic motivation. Reflection and exposition, and getting people to think about what they've done, getting people to tell tales and engage with stories, getting people to make interesting choices, giving people information about why they're making those choices, helping them have a playful space, because play is the ability to actually fail in a boundaried space. Let them have a space to fail in, and getting them engaged. And these are actually things that you can think about in your games. In my Going, Going, Gone board game, I designed it at the same time I was studying play. And one of the things I did in that game that makes it different is in each round of that game, their players have 5 auctions going off simultaneously in about 10 seconds. Because I got so bored of auction games where everyone's sitting around the table thinking about their money. I'll bid 7. I'll bid 8. Like, that's not how auctions work. You know how auctions work. You know, you're quickly clicking refresh, raising your hand. I wanted to create that situation by having time pressure. By the way, time pressure makes people stupid. So just remember to put that in your games to make people stupid with time pressure. But anyway, so what I wanted to do is the playful aspect. I tested it with a timer, a 10-second timer. I said, well, you could have an app for 10 seconds. But I said, what if you give one player the ability to set the pace of that auction? So the player who has this auction paddle is going to count from 10 to 1, but that player gets to choose the pace at which they count. So if they want to make the game crazy, they can say 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Everyone's busy bidding on things really fast. Or they can say 10, 9. And then each player gets a chance to be that auctioneer. And so that's a concept of play, where I, as the game designer, am giving up control of my game and letting the players make those choices. So as you're making games, think about how could you incorporate play to give the player some ability to control what's going on. Now, this term gamification, I want to compare it to another term, game-based learning. And these are the 2 terms I see mixed up quite a bit, and I want to help you know how to talk about them so that if you decide to actually, because when you're done tonight, you actually could go out and begin consulting with organizations around games, and using the right language is important. So gamification is where you have elements on top of the real world. We're doing something in the real world. We're throwing away trash. We're making sales. We're taking steps. We're learning a language. And we've added this layer on top of the real world that we're going to motivate you by getting you to engage with this layer. But they're separate things. You can pull that layer off and you're still doing the real world thing. Game-based learning, on the other hand, is this concept of gameful design. The idea that you're going in and saying, I'm going to integrate the learning with the game. Here's the aha about why you all can be good at this. So to be a game designer, your job as a game designer is to put obstacles in the way of players and then encourage them to want to climb those obstacles. That's what we do. The player is here. You put a goal in front of the player. You say, your job is to get there. And then I'm going to put some things in the way and make your life more difficult, because that's what I get to do. But it can't be too difficult or you'll give up. And I'm going to use narrative or powering up or competition or something like that to get you to want to climb those obstacles. And as a game designer, that's your life. You're balancing making someone's life more difficult and also helping them to achieve those goals. But that's what we do as game designers. And as I've thought about this, I thought, you know, who else does this? Teachers. The way teachers teach is they make obstacles that they put in front of students. But they have to motivate the students to try to climb over those obstacles, and while they're climbing over those obstacles, they're learning things. So you all are actually very close to teachers. The same things you do of making obstacles and motivating players to get over your obstacles if you think about how do you incorporate learning outcomes into those obstacles, so as you climb the obstacles, you're actually learning something, you can take the games you're making today and actually help teach something as people are playing them. So this is an example of when I talk about gamification in a class, it is like the syllabus. You're not supposed to read this. This is the syllabus, but it's this idea of points that motivate people to do stuff. They're relatively meaningless, and they have no connection to the actual content in the class. It is simply my carrot and stick to get you to do stuff, and that's like gamification. Game-based learning, on the other hand, is the integration of content into the activity, that by engaging with the activity, you're actually getting to learn stuff. So when you see someone say gamification when they mean game-based learning or vice versa, now I empower you to say, wait a minute, you should actually be using this term. And the reason why is because of motivation. That gamification is based on extrinsic motivation. It's based on rewards. It's based on incentives. Game-based learning is based on play. It's based on building intrinsic motivation. It allows people to want to be engaged in it because you're using playful methods to explore. And that's why it's important to talk about these differently. And I hope to empower you all to do game-based learning as you're creating this stuff. There's lots of different ways to call game-based learning. Having all of these terms and being able to talk about them interchangeably is useful because when you talk to different people, they may want to hear different things. They may want to hear simulations if they're in the government or in business. They may want to hear experiential learning if they're teaching in a classroom. They may want to hear corporate training games or persuasive games. Persuasive games are games with social messages. Transformative games or transformational games focusing on the change. All of these are different terms that you can use around this concept of game-based learning. And this is one of the things that I do in my program over the 4 years I have students. I teach them how to use all these terms, but at reality, they're all the same thing. So this is what we don't do. So there's 2 rules in my board game design class. Rule 1, no games where you roll a die and move a piece on a board. Because there's always better ways to have players choose something to... Yes, you can clap for that. Now, I should say, you can use that well, but you better know what you're doing. So there are ways to use roll and move and actually make it engaging, but most people, when they first use roll and move, don't. And so no games where you roll a die, move a piece on the board. Instead, you're making a simulation. You're giving players choice. The second rule in my class is no learning games where you ask trivia questions off cards. Because that doesn't teach you anything. You're just answering multiple choice questions. Instead, again, it's about simulating situations and getting people to think about what they're doing and making choices that have impact. So we're not making human-sized board games to teach anything, which you can find in Pinterest. And dear God, we're not making these sort of digital versions of roll and move board games, which is now what you see out there. It's like, oh yes, we'll roll a die and move on the board and answer a trivia. I actually saw on Twitter a VR game, and someone said, look, it's the future of learning languages. And it was asking multiple choice questions with people in different VR situations. It's like, it looks like you're driving a car. Which way do you want to turn? And it pops up with, it's like, what are you doing? Anyway, so we don't do this kind of stuff. We also shouldn't make these life-size board games. This was actually at the New York State Fair. This was designed to teach you something. And so you would roll a die and you could walk around this. Actually, you wouldn't roll a die. You'd flip a coin and it would be moved 1 or 2 spaces. And then there were trivia questions in the room. I took these pictures during the fair, during one of the busiest days of the fair. What do you not notice? This doesn't work. So again, we can try, and you think about this and say, well, that's really silly, but I was actually, 3 months ago, I was here in Toronto. I was over at the big square on Yonge and Dundas, and they had a big, giant board game designed to teach you something or other about athletics with the giant die, and of course, no one was playing it. I'm like, well, we can help. We know games. There we go. Please don't do that. No matter what, something-opoly. There's whatever opoly you can find an opoly that's going to do this. So we don't want to do this kind of thing. So some of the criticism that I make about this stuff is around these concepts of play. And if I say, hey, I'm going to get you to play games to actually make a difference, well, is that really play? Because if the idea of play, this was actually a challenge. The person who curates the Museum of Play came up to me after I talked once. And he said, Scott, you know, you're making people use play. And so the idea was, if you take play and you make play required, it's no longer play. You can't call it that. This idea of using player games for assessment, you're going to do stuff and I'm going to grade you on it, is really problematic for me because it's no longer play at that point. It's something else. That if you are having games and play as a recreational activity, yet you're grading people on it, that's not the same thing. You can't call it a game. You can't call it play anymore. So I'll see people be very critical about using these games in that way. And so I want you to be careful of how you talk about these games we're doing. So what we have are some interesting opportunities out there. And one of those is the idea of adding real-world content to recreational games. Who's played Freedom? If you haven't seen Freedom, it's an interesting game where it's a cooperative game where you've got slaves in the South and you're trying to bring them up to Canada. And you're working together to try and move these slaves up. And there are slave captures in the game. The person who made this, Brian Mayer, is a librarian, actually, from Rochester. And he wanted to help it's a recreational game, but he wanted to help bring these concepts to life. So it's got some real-world concepts in there. It's got tough decisions because it's not easy to do. And he took on a thorny issue, as you might imagine, this idea of, hey, let's have a fun game about bringing slaves to Canada, yay. But it's come out through Academy Press, but it's a tough game because you have to make decisions at each turn. You're always deciding, weighing a few versus many, letting a large group be able to escape, but someone else gets captured and sent back south. There's historical events that come into play. We've actually been doing this for a while with lots of games that bring real-world content and connect them in. This whole world of historical games. How many people have played these kind of historical games at some point? If you think about all of the real-world stuff that's actually baked into this world of historical game design has actually been really good at this for a while. That's something that they do. And it's an interesting challenge in game design is how do you balance a situation that wasn't fair in history, but make a game that is fair? One of the things I tell my students when they make a serious game is that serious game does not have to be fair, because sometimes it is through playing the game that you're actually exploring that thing that wasn't fair. But that really falls in counter with a lot of what we do with our Euro games, where we expect everyone to have a balanced field and a fair game and a fair situation. So one way that many of these historical games do that is they give each player different win conditions based upon how disadvantaged they are. So but there's a lot of models in this world, which is what actually the US was doing a lot of game design in this space, while Germany was busy doing design on economic games and non-confrontational games. The US was doing a lot of historical games. Now they've all kind of blended together, so it's not really worth talking about Euro games and that space. It's not worth talking about. But this history of these games that have real-world context is interesting to look at. You can also integrate real-world context through what you're doing in the game. So Robot Turtles is a think fun game where you're learning the basics of coding. So you're driving turtles around, you're trying to pick up diamonds, you're pushing other turtles, which is actually very similar to Robo Rally, if you've ever played that one. Again, you're programming robots. It's teaching you how programmers say bad words, because that's what happens when you run your program and your robot falls into a pit. But Robot Turtle, for example, it teaches kids about subroutines. So it has this cool thing where you can have a number of move cards that are assigned to one card, and whenever you play that one card, then it executes the subroutine. Peptide is one of a series of games where you're exploring amino acid chains. And by playing the game, you're understanding these things. And these are games that are all out in that recreational market. But they're taking some real-world content. And the nice thing is, when you start to think about your theme for the game, yes, you could think about zombies, or you could think about one of these things. Or you could say, there's lots of good real-world stuff that we could actually incorporate. Third World Debt, which is a game that puts all of you in the role of a third world country in a horrible debt to first world countries, and you're all trying to dig your way out. Doesn't that sound fun? It's very difficult, and it's one of these where someone might make it out, everyone might just get crushed. And so actually, ironically, the publisher who published this game was also the publisher who published Tulipmania, was also the publisher that went bankrupt. Maybe he should have played more of his own games. But the idea of taking this concept of an alternate economy, and as you play it, you get to understand. One of the challenges with these kind of games, and something I face, I'm making a lot of escape rooms that are based in history spaces, is balancing real history versus historical fiction. And so one thing that's important to do if you decide to make these kind of games is to inform the player somewhere in the rule book what's real and what's made up. To say somewhere in there, by the way, these things are actually all real. Like in Tulipmania, I did research on why bubble markets happen, and I put the players in the roles of the jerks that are manufacturing this bubble market. And I said, this is actually how these things can get going. But let them know also, now we made all this stuff up as well. So it's important to have that disclaimer for the players to know. You can also make games for organizations, and this is actually where a lot of my game design has gone nowadays. So people say, Scott, why haven't you made more games? And I said, well, I have, but I can't show them to you because I'm making them for groups. I'm hired by an organization to make a training game, to make a game that they use in their organization, but it's never published outside of that organization. But as a game designer, if you're looking for new markets, if you're looking for places to make games, and you go to a corporate HR, for example, is a place where they're seeking game designers because the best they know is Something-opoly or Ask a Quiz, you can provide other ways of making these games and making games that actually live in an organization. This particular game actually is in a museum. So museums are places that are using more and more games. And museums actually like analog games because it gets people out of their screens for a little bit and gets them actually engaging in that physical world. So in this game's designed to get you to talk to other people about what it is you're seeing. So the cards give you quests. And so you take a card when you come into the museum and it gives you a quest, and the quest is going to involve you talking with other people and engaging with them. And so having games that get that engagement going can be useful, but we know how to get engagement going because that's what we do when we make our tabletop games. We have this Rolodex of game mechanisms that we already have to get people engaged that we can begin to bring over to these other contexts. Should I just point at you? So, some of the places you could think about, and the reason why I'm going to give you this list, and this is the first thing that's on the Twitter, so twitter.com/snicholson. If you go to that handout, you've got this list on there. This list is your bread and butter. These are the people, if you have an aunt, an uncle, a brother, sister, mother, father, relation, whatever that works at any of these places, talk to them about how they could use games, because you might find the door opened to a new way of getting your game designs out there, getting people to engage with them. The first are cultural heritage organizations, libraries, museums, historical sites, living villages. These are places that are looking to use games to get people to engage with each other. Museums and libraries, they're using analog games. There are some digital games as well, but I'm focusing this talk on analog games, the stuff we're doing here that you can take. In living history spaces, they very much use these tabletop games. And if you do anything with role-playing games, if you're working with RPGs, or I work with escape rooms, which are like live-action role-playing games, these places are really excited to bring these sort of concepts in. I've got an escape room that I made for a national park in the US that has people playing saboteurs, trying to figure out how to destroy the fort. And as they're doing it, they're learning about the fort. The second are educational organizations. So schools, teachers are looking for ways to bring games into the classroom and engage kids and get them more interested. Churches, if you have a church that you're a part of, they might be interested in exploring how could you use games in a way that's not just a reskin of Settlers of Catan or Carcassonne, but actually get people to engage in what's going on. Nonprofit organizations that are trying to educate people to do something. Here's the little word I use. Here's my question I use with anyone. How is your organization trying to motivate people? That's the question I ask. Who are you trying to motivate to do something? And it could be someone that they're trying to motivate who's on the outside, or it could be something they're trying to motivate who is an employee. So you've got both external and internal people, users you can make games for. So that's the question I ask. Who are you trying to motivate? And then you can talk to them about, well, what if we could make a game to help that motivation work better? Governmental organizations. So as I mentioned earlier, we were funded by the government of Ontario this summer to make climate change games. So we made 2 games that have helped people to adopt new climate change behaviors. We made one look like an educational game and one that looked like a recreational game. Now we're testing those to see which one makes a bigger difference. So we have random sample testing going on educational games, recreational games, and actually something that's just a set of websites and videos, the normal stuff you'd use to teach. And then we're going to measure over a year to see do either of those, any of those, make a difference in people's day-to-day behavior. So there's a lot of government organizations. Again, if you have if you have someone that works for any of these organizations, talk to them about, that's that question. Well, how is your organization trying to motivate people? And think about how to go from there. The space of healthcare, hospitals, therapy, outreach sites, mental health. There's a lot of interest in bringing games in, getting people more motivated with what's going on. Training. Corporate training is a gold mine waiting for designers because there's a lot of really badly designed corporate training and HR games. How many of you have played a badly designed HR game and you're like, they are eager for what we can bring and they have money. That's something I want to help you understand. This is a place you can, doesn't all have to be for free. You can actually make a living doing this, and I want to encourage you to think about how to do that. Marketing. So marketing, right now a lot of marketing uses contests. As I tell my students, if you have to reward people to play your game isn't any good. So instead, you can make marketing games that actually get people engaged. Burger King did this years ago. They put out a series of games for the Xbox that were really creepy, that had the Burger King guy. Some people are nodding. Some people remember these things. Like one was sneaking, and so the Burger King guy would sneak up and give people a burger. And we laugh at that now, but if you go online right now and search for Kentucky Fried Chicken Escape Room, you can find KFC has just put out a VR-based escape room experience for their employees to teach them how to bread and fry chicken. And it is so creepy because you've got the colonel there, and he wants to make sure this chicken is cooked just right, and you got 10 minutes to do it. Don't you do it wrong. So it's quite disturbing. And so that's a case where we could stand up and say, there might be a more positive way to do this that isn't going to give people nightmares about chicken parts. Got to wash those chicken parts. Anyway, the space of social justice. So one of the things our games do really well is they build empathy. Games can help people build empathy by putting them in a role they don't normally play. And that activity is fantastic for social justice concepts by helping people to build empathy around something they don't know. So these are all different domains that you may want to consider as a way of taking your game ideas, and the game ideas that you have right now in front of you can be adopted into these spaces. You've already got the mechanisms and the concepts, but now you can find new markets for your games. And it's like some of the games I showed you earlier, Evolution, and the coding game, and 1962, all of these sorts of games, they're being used not only in the recreational market, but the educational market. And so that gives you new markets where your games can be sold. If you can get something for grade 10 civics, you can find all of a sudden, hey, you can have thousands of people buying your game that weren't in that recreational market. So it opens up new marketplaces for what you're doing. So Gutsy is a card game that was made for a museum, a health museum. And so the idea here is that you are playing a game where you've got different sorts of bacteria in your gut. And as you play the game, you get to see how that bacteria works and deals with things. But it's actually a fun game. And the guy who made this actually plays all of our games. He does this kind of stuff. This is what, and he made this game and pitched it to the museum. And the museum said, that sounds great. And now you can buy it in the gift shop, and you can play Gutsy there on the floor and learn about all the guts that are crawling around inside of you. There was a recent one, Dice Tower pick of Viral. Has anyone seen that one? So that one actually has the parts of the body and viruses moving around. And it's actually our game. We have a game of the month every month where we get people to try some of these games. And so that's our game of the month for next month because it helps you understand the circulation system and how if you're a virus and you can get into the heart, it's like, yeah, the world is my oyster. And that's like the truck, you can drive the truck to anywhere. That'll be my change. Hey. But then you have stuff like this. This is really for sale. This is from a website. I'm not going to make, oh wait, I did credit them. Okay, I guess I will make fun of them because I don't take IP from people. These are for reals. You can buy them right now. You can play the drug round game, the care certificate game, the communication game, all of which are move a piece on a board and ask trivia questions. This is the model right now. And this is what I want to show you, is that there are opportunities for you. You could reach out to this company right here. They publish these games and say, hey, how about I make a more engaging game based on those same concepts? They're open to these things because they don't know other models. It's the same thing we do when we go out and talk to people about, hey, I see you're playing Monopoly. Would you like to write a memo? No, Clippy. I see you're playing Monopoly. Would you like to try some other games? And so the idea here is that we can introduce folks to other game models. I like that. So this is Jungle Escape. Jungle Escape is put up by a company. There's a training company, HRDQ, in the US that does these kind of training games. So this looks very fancy. So what you get is you get a binder with your game instructions. You get a bag with the logo on it. This actually feels to me like a Kickstarter campaign gone a little crazy. And now a stretch goal, a water bottle, a Jungle Escape. I'll bid $1 million. And so the basic idea, and the soundtrack with music, it sounded like Kickstarter, and then Connects. So remember Connects, the kids' toy? Yeah. So what goes on in this game is one team sees the helicopter all completed, and they have to communicate to the other teams how to build the helicopter out of the Connects. Yay. So that's the game. How much do you think this game costs? $80, $200, $1,000, let's see. $608 US for Jungle Escape, 5th edition. Fifth. the 5th edition. This game has published so many copies at 608. Let's do some math here, shall we, on what these... Okay, so here's what I've learned about corporate training games. You can do what we do in this room. You can add a context and a debriefing, and then you can add 1 or 2 zeros to the end of whatever it was you were going to charge, and you have a corporate training game. And it is that way. Go and browse HRDQ. They're the leader in making corporate training games, and they are open to designs. I've talked to them. They would love to hear new designs. The stuff we're making in here works in this world of corporate training. I mean, when this is a flagship game, build a Connect system like someone else, and then they can help you with all the doodads and Kickstarter bonuses and all that. But you see this, and I'm like, and if you know that typically in board games, you're getting about 5% of that in royalties every time someone buys your game. Ooh, do a little math there. So, take a look at this. This is a world that's open to good designs and interesting designs, and if you look to see these things that they do, they're what we're already doing in our games. We're just doing them in made-up, unapplied worlds, and we can twist them and make them decision. Does anyone happen to be showing a game here that has people making decisions? Does anyone dealing with conflict? We're already doing this. So what you end up having to add to your game to make this work, here's what you need. 1, you need some sort of a fun theme that will fit in a corporate environment. So probably not death to the zombies, 2, you need to have a booklet that explains to a facilitator how to run your game. So you need instructions to help someone take your game and run it for people. 3, you need to have instructions for that facilitator about the conversation they lead after your game to get people to talk about the skill. That's the idea. It's called debriefing or reflection. It's a critical part in these kind of training games. That's a part we miss in our games. Now, when we're doing playtesting, we do the debriefing. But when actually you throw it out in the field, you rarely do the debriefing afterwards. So having a guide that says, here's how to set the context for the game, here's how to play the game, and then here's how to do the debriefing afterwards, and here's the stuff to talk about, that's really all you need to do to add to the games you already have here to say, and that would be $608 for that copy of the game. Now, one of the reasons why that's so much is because that then empowers the corporate trainer, which now can be all of you, to go to an organization and say, you'd like me to run what's it called? Jungle Escape? I can facilitate that for you. That'll be $5,000 for the day. And that is what you could do. So I want to help you understand. I want to open the door to say if money is important, then you can tell I came from the US, can't you? Anyway, but if this is something, if you're tired as a game designer and you're frustrated, look at these worlds because there are spaces that you can take your designs and actually make money off of them in a way that you don't do in the recreational market, or even you can do them both, put something out in both markets. But look at what's going on out there because it's an opportunity. This is another example. So this is the Visual Explorers Facilitator set. What this is a series of cards that are all 6 by 4 inches. That's it. $340, that's right, we have a winner. So, it's just a series of photographs on cards. Now, I do something different for that one. I bought Dixit. So, I have every set of Dixit in one deck, and that is and so here's the sort of thing you can do, all right? Corporate organization, you'd like me to come and run it. What is your problem? Okay, you're having 2 groups that are having conflict with each other. Okay, we can do a game for that. So let's bring everyone into the room. Let's bring the 2 sides. You're going to sit on either side. Now I'm going to spread out all my Dixit cards. And everyone's like, oh, look at all the pretty pictures. And then you say, okay, what I'd like you to do is I'm going to point to someone. You come up, pick up a card that allows you to reflect upon what you're doing right now in your situation and talk about it. There's your game. Go. So that's this idea of using what we already have and what we already know to get people to engage. And that's a lot more interesting than roll a die, move a piece on a board, or going out and playing paintball, or going out and doing an escape room. Oh, wait. Shoot. Anyway. So there's 6 things to think about when you're making these kind of games. These are sort of your big 6 categories. First is discovery. So discovery is games where you're getting people to talk about themselves, to learn something they don't already have. So that's this idea of the game is designed to get you to either talk about yourself or to role play and talk about a group. talk about, we're going to role-play customers, and we're going to play managers, and we're going to explore this situation. So you could take any of our role-playing games that we have, where you're given a character, you could swap out those characters with real-world situations and start to talk about, well, what's actually going on. Decision-making. So that's this idea of getting people to explore a situation and make a decision. By simulating the sort of decisions they're making on a regular basis, you can build that into a game and have people simulate that so that when they have a decision to make in the real world, they have a better idea of what might happen based upon the decisions that they make. Simulation. So simulation is the idea that you're simulating some complex situation. This is a case where actually board games work better than digital games. You may have tried digital versions of board games. I don't particularly like them in general because they automate too much. If you've played Small World and you take all your moves and then the computer goes, you win, and you're like, what happened? And because the game, while it's like, oh, it's so easy, it takes care of all the scoring for you, it's like, yeah, but I don't understand what's going on. And so if you've played these app-based games, the problem is they automate the process and now you don't get it, which can be fine, like if I'm playing Eclipse and I want to try to understand, oh, what are all the different possible paths I could take, and I don't want to deal with all the counting, that's fine. But if you're making a game to teach people stuff, and you're automating the stuff they need to be learning, then you're taking away the ability for them to learn. So our tabletop games, because they require the players to make the process happen, that creates the opportunities to learn. And that creates the opportunities to explore. That creates the opportunities to simulate. So the more you automate, the less people can actually learn from it. And then there's three that are more outcome-oriented. So the first one is education. So that's this idea that I'm putting obstacles in your way, and as you're going over these obstacles, you're learning stuff, and the stuff you're learning you can then use, and then you reflect afterwards about what it is that you learned. So the idea that you're trying to help people acquire new skills, acquire new concepts, and help them assess. And here's a model for teaching. So for doing corporate training, here's the model to put into your pocket. Give people some challenge to do, let them fail, reflect upon why they failed. Give them a tool, let them succeed with the tool, reflect upon how they succeeded. Ta-da! That's really it. You can use that model. We're going to do it right now. Everyone close your eyes. Everyone close your eyes. What we're going to do is we're going to do a little activity. So the way this activity is going to work is your goal is to count from 1 to 10. It's not very hard. You can't say anything except for the numbers from 1 to 10. Now, you can't say more than one number, and the goal is to not speak over anyone else. So as a community right now, I'm going to shut up, and our goal is to be able to count from 1 to 10. But if anyone speaks at the same time as someone else, we have to start over. And you can only speak one number from 1 to 10. Go.
1, 2.
Oh, start again.
1,
2.
3.
Oh, start again.
1,
2.
3.
Start again.
1,
2.
3, 4, 5, 6.
Oh, start again.
1,
2.
3, 4.
Okay, stop. So you're struggling a little bit. Now this is where I would run a corporate training reflection. We talk about some of the challenges you're having. How does that relate to what you're feeling at work? How does that relate to teamwork? How does that relate to conflict management? How does that relate to communication? Now I'm going to give you a tool. This new tool is saying we're actually going to run this in order on this table alone. So only the people I'm pointing to here are going to speak, and you're going to speak in order from 1 to 10. Everyone close your eyes. We're going to try it again.
1, 2,
3,
4,
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
All right, yay! Succeeded. Now we can reflect about planning. We can reflect upon how bringing a plan, talking about what you're going to do, having a leader involved in the process. You can see where this goes. So you can take the games you already have, and you can add. The nice thing about reflection afterwards is it's not about the thing you did. It's about how you reflected about the thing you did. That is actually where the learning happens. So that model of give them a hard challenge, let them fail, give them a tool, let them succeed, reflect upon what's going on, that's something to put in your toolbox now that when you're working with people, something to turn to. The other stuff is persuasion. Persuasion is when you're trying to persuade people to convey a political point, to somehow shape their opinions. And our games can work well to affect people through this empathy concept. By playing roles of someone that you aren't, you might understand something about the world you didn't understand previously, and that's where persuasion can happen. And motivation. So motivation is where you get into badges, scores, and other rewards. This is that gamification stuff. This is kind of that stuff I don't really want to do. I want to encourage you to use all these other things, to use gameful design and playful design, and not turn to just rewards to incentivize people. So here are your steps. This is the second thing that you'll find on the handout on Twitter. Again, twitter.com/snicholson. There's a link to this Google Doc. These are the steps you do. This is how you do it. First, you identify the organization and the audience. So this is a difference in design. You are now, rather than start with a mechanism, or rather than start with, hey, you know, it'd be cool, or rather than start with drinking a lot of beer, instead you start with, who are we making a game for, and who's the audience that we're making that game? So what organization are we working with, and what's the audience? And it's actually, if you've heard of the term user experience design, we actually take a lot of pages from that book. You know what the difference is between user experience design and game design? So user experience design is the idea that the user wants to accomplish something. And in user experience design, you want to make that as simple as possible. You want to take away all the barriers. In game design, you know your user wants to accomplish something, and you want to make their lives difficult. And so that's how they balance out. User experience design is about making people's lives simple, and game designers are making people's lives more complex. However, we also want to make sure that the stuff that's not supposed to be complex or hard is easy. So as I get older, for example, I get really sensitive to card games that decide we need to see a giant picture and all the important stuff is in tiny little print on the bottom of the card, and I'm supposed to read it across the table and make decisions about it. I'm an old guy. Come on, help my eyes here. So anyway, and then so identify the organization first and the audience you're making stuff for, and they're in your mind the whole time. If it's an audience of 8 to 10-year-olds, then you probably don't want to take a model of a complex war game to bring in. Well, unless you're going to let them actually just beat each other up, then that may work out fine. Then what is the outcome? What's the change you're trying to make? And you define that, and you work with the organization. Say, well, what's the change I actually want to make in people? And be very specific, because many times when you make the game, the organization is then going to say, okay, prove it. And if you haven't set up to say, here's the change we're going to make, and here's how we're going to prove it, then you can't do that. And a lot of what I'm showing you here is actually how teachers think and how librarians think. It's the same idea. So like what we're doing now, we're testing these climate change games to see, did they actually make a difference? And in the center of all game design decisions, you're always saying, does this decision fit in the organization? Does it fit for the audience we're thinking of? And does it bring about the learning outcome? Because if your answer to any of those questions is no, then you probably want to rethink and change that. But the nice thing about this is it now gives you a guide to making these decisions. Right now, when you're testing your games and you're trying to decide, do I try this or this, you don't have a lot of good questions to ask. What makes it more engaging? You can ask some of those questions, but now you have a very specific question. Does it make this outcome more likely to happen for this user in this organizational context? And make all your decisions toward that point. So the next thing to think about, what's the real-world situation where this outcome matters? So you're trying to teach kids statistics and probability. And you want to make a game about it. And you want to think, rather than just teach them generic, I want to actually think about what's the place where this actually matters. A great example where that sort of knowledge actually matters is in the world of insurance, or in the world of gambling. Or is there a difference? Not really. So you could actually help people understand that. They could help them understand that that world of gambling and that world of insurance are kind of the same thing. You're placing money down on the odds that something will or won't happen to you to get a payout. So you can actually teach these, why do you need to learn the concept of expected value? So that when you're in Walmart and the guy says, hey, do you want to pay $10 for the extended warranty on that Super Nintendo system? You can do the math and say, no. The other option, if you can't think of a real world situation, is to come up with a fictional world situation where you're going to define that world. But the reason why you want to stick to real world, if you can, is because the closer someone is to the situation they're playing in the game, the more likely they are to take the learning and apply it. The further out they are from the real world situation happening, the less likely they are to apply the learning. So that's why if you can think of a real world situation to put your game in, it's actually going to have a better chance of having the learners learn the thing you're trying to teach them. So the next step, what are the roles that are involved? So if you have a real world situation, now what are the roles? So let's take our insurance gambling game. So the roles that are going on there, so you're going to have the customers, so the people that are looking to buy insurance. You're going to have the people that are looking to sell insurance. You may have a level higher if you want to get into the idea of companies that hold insurance policies and help pay for those insurance policies. You may say that's too complex. But you want to think about what are the roles involved. So you're thinking about your learning outcome, an audience, an organization. you're thinking about your situation. Number 3, who's involved with that situation? What are the roles that are involved? And so typically, this is what you have in a game. Someone has something, and someone needs something, someone else is in the way. So you want to ask these questions. What are the roles that are involved? Because you want to get the players involved with those roles. And you want to then ask, what role or roles will the players take in the game? So here's the trick on that. There's a little quote I use in my game design classes, and I talk about the concept of flip the script. Now, flip the script, the idea is that when you're thinking about that game, you think about each role and say, would that be interesting for players to do? So in the role of insurance, you would think, is it interesting for players to play the role as people looking to buy insurance? Maybe, maybe not. Then you think, is it interesting to play the role of people looking to sell insurance? Oh, well, that's a little bit more interesting because you're flipping the script. You're putting the player in that role of having those insurance tools, and then you simulate the other things in the game. So in this case, you might have lots of players. In Tulipmania, what I did is I gave each player a set of cards that represented buyers for tulip bulbs. And you were manipulating those buyers because I wanted to put you in that role. So you give the players one or more roles. You can have games where you put the players in both roles. So you might say some players are going to play people that are seeking insurance. Some players are playing people that are trying to sell insurance. And they are negotiating. But it's worth exploring as you're making the game each role and say which role is most interesting, which role will bring about that learning outcome. And then you want to think about what platform makes the most sense. And in our case, this would be so you've got digital and analog platform, but even with analog platform, we've got a variety of choices. We can do dice games, we can do card games, we can do tabletop role-playing games, we can do big board games, we can do large-scale interactive things where we're all moving around a space. We can do small-scale interactive things. The more different types of games you've played, the bigger your toolkit is on what games can be. So you want to think about how do we get people engaged. Here's Scott's little shortcut tip number 27. When making a learning game more effective, take any role that normally one person would do and make people play that role as a pair, as a team. Because having a team of 2 make decisions for one player action in the game forces them to talk about it. And when you have to talk about your decisions, you then are reflecting upon what you're learning. You're verbalizing what's going on. So to increase the learning on any learning game, take what would normally be a single-player role and make a pair of people make decisions about it. And so every time you're always coming back to the organization. So in this case, you have to say, all right, I'm making this game, and it's going to be for grade 10 classrooms. How can I get games out to grade 10 classrooms? Well, the reality is teachers don't have a lot of money, so what you may have to do is come up with a print-and-play game. You have to think about how is that game going to get out there. If you say, no, they have to buy my $80 game, my $608 game, that's probably not going to work out very well. But you want to think about how is it going to be distributed and think about the audience. What experience does my audience have with games? Most likely they are not as sophisticated with complex board games as we are. So you don't want to have games that are going to take 45 minutes to learn. You want to have something that's simpler. Finally, what experiences in the game will bring about a change in the player? So this is where you want to think about what are those obstacles I'm making them hop over? And as they're doing that, how are they learning? How can we measure that stuff? You always come back to the question of, because this is the most important stuff. If it doesn't do that, it probably shouldn't be in the game. You want to focus on those experiences that actually make a difference. And then finally, as I've talked about reflection a little bit, how do you create moments where the players reflect about what's going on? Where they think about things, where they step back, because learning actually doesn't happen just by doing. Dewey, who's a learning theorist, says that learning comes from doing and reflecting. As a great example of this, have you ever watched a kid at a science museum? So they run over to something, they push some buttons, and if it doesn't do anything right away, they run over to something else and they push some buttons. And even if it does anything, and they're bored with it, they run over to something else and they push some buttons. And you say, how was your day? It was great. What'd you do? Had fun. What'd you learn? Can we have ice cream? Without that moment of reflection, of thinking about what you've done, you actually don't learn. And that's a problem that we have with doing games, is that if we have the people play the game, but they don't actually reflect upon what went on in the game, then they don't actually learn. So in our tabletop games, because we're looking at each other, because we're engaging directly with each other, we have those moments to talk about what's going on. We can build in those moments of reflection into the game. Who here has played Time Stories? Time Stories is a game that's designed to be played multiple times. Kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure game, there's lots of wrong paths, and every time you make a choice, a little time counter ticks down. And when that time counter runs out, then you lose, and you have to start the game over. And the only way you win is by playing the game a number of times, and each time you play, you learn what are the wrong choices to avoid. Between each round of time stories, there's a time to reflect, where you talk to the players and say, oh, okay, so we need to avoid this and do this, we need to do these things. And you're talking and sharing ideas so that the next time you play, you can be successful. So time stories has a built-in reflection time in it. And think about with your game, how do I create moments in my game where people will actually reflect during the play? Because that's where that reflection, the way learning works is you are a self, you have stuff in your brain, and then I show you something new, and that new thing's over there. And my brain says, I don't want that new thing. It doesn't look like something I want. And you, as the instructor, have to build a scaffold between that person and that thing out there. Now, sometimes that's be someone else who says, hey, I got this. Come here. It's okay. Trust me. And that person, that someone else can actually make that connection. That's why we do little group activities in classes, because we want to help, if we as a teacher aren't getting the learner to learn, we want to help someone else to be that little connection point. But as the game can make those connections for players, they can say, hey, here's where you are right now, here's this thing I'm showing you, and I'm going to help give you this moment to think about, hey, why might that actually matter in your life? So, what we're going to do now, it's okay. There's a little bit of time left, and what I wanted to do was have one of those moments of reflection. So I have given you basically the highlights of a 4-year Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in the last hour or so. So if you will swipe your credit card on this machine, we can print out, oh wait, no, that's American of me. Wait, oh, anyway, so what I'd like you to do now is with some of the people around you, I would like you to talk about ahas that you had about how you could connect games to something in the real world. So find some folks around you. We'll take a few minutes to talk about what ahas did you just have during this talk that said, hey, I actually do that. So what we want to do now, you've had a chance to talk about some of the ahas, some of the ideas that you had. Some of you have some ideas that maybe are like, hey, I want to share this with everyone. And now is your opportunity, because we have handheld mics, and what we'd like to do now is encourage people who would like to share something that their group came up with. And I would like to say, feel free to share something that someone in your group said without pointing them out. That way, it doesn't have to be you. It's like someone, it could be your idea, and you could say, someone in our group said that. So who would like to share something that came out of the group discussion that you had? Again, it doesn't have to be yours, but something that really you thought was cool. You could share that now. Or do we go back to the counting thing from 1 to 3? All right, here we go. And here's the cool thing. I'm going to hand you the mic, and you have to give it to the next person.
All right. So I'm relatively new to the designer space, so I didn't even think about board games at a corporate learning level. So that's a neat concept to me. But I've been on the receiving end of those sort of HR training things, and they're often just utter garbage.
Yep.
So I think there's a really interesting space where we can spend time developing something that isn't garbage. Because so many times you hear that cookie cutter, like, oh, we're going to do trust falls. It's like, great, I know what that is. Screw that concept. So I think there's like an opportunity to make something really interesting in that space, especially if you've been in that space and experienced the shit that's usually in that space. So that was neat for me, was thinking about that and thinking about, well, I've been there and it sucked. How can I make that better? So who's
Thank you
next?
for
All right,
sharing.
over there. Oh.
Yeah. So we got 2 mics, so we're good.
Oh, okay. Hello? Oh. Hi, I'm Andy. One of the things we didn't discuss, I just, one of the things I
Blame
remember,
it on someone around you. Blame it on the guy with the blue beard.
Well, it's funny because I actually, my company actually the company I work for works in the rewards recognition loyalty space.
All right, so I was talking about you.
So it was really funny when you brought up the whole thing with the star carved out of the guy's head and all, or whatever. That was interesting that basically rewards actually gets rid of motivation in a sense. And I'm actually, I see that because when we're doing the development for all the stuff that we do for that space, I always it just felt wrong the entire time I've been working in it, and now I know why it just feels so wrong. Yeah, so how many of you have Fitbits sitting in a drawer? And the problem is with any of those, they work great in the short term. Yeah. Companies love it because you see a short-term increase.
If you've ever done like a workplace weight loss program or anything like that, they're great in the short term, but as soon as those rewards go away, then they don't want to do it anymore, and it's hurt any pre-existing intrinsic motivation they had to do the thing. So it's really bad around things like healthcare and social justice and anything like that. If you can't get that benefit you need as an organization in the short term, it's dangerous, and it can actually. This has been one of the things I've gotten on soapboxes about. I've given a TEDx talk all about this problem because I think it's a real issue. So you can take it back and change the world.
I will.
Yay! Who else has something to share that was cool in your group? Oh, I've seen a couple hands. And there's one behind too if you want to go.
I'm only tangentially into board games, but I work a lot with small children.
Okay.
And the idea of gamification comes up all the time,
Yeah.
and about how do you then break out of the reward cycle once you've set it. I think that idea of intrinsic gameful is really, really interesting. I'd love to see what is happening for educational games for people who aren't fully literate. There's a real cusp of literacy that you need for a lot of board games. You need to be about 12 or 13 and have that attention span.
Yeah, and I think that space is where we look at models from role-playing. In role-playing games where you are not having to read things, but instead you're exploring roles and you're focusing more on play. You're getting people to act out roles and act out situations. And so taking what we already know about how there's, I don't know if you know the world of tabletop role-playing. In the last 10 years, it has gone through incredible design cycles. It's actually, tabletop role-playing in the last decade is what board games did in like 95 to 2005. Tabletop role-playing has done that over the last 10 years or so. And it's really interesting to watch those cycles of storytelling and getting away from heavy-duty character sheets and getting more into, hey, let's tell a story together. And that's where I think about using, with kids, think about using models from improv comedy, and exploring challenging situations by getting them to improv and act around that kind of stuff. So we have the models out there, but it's not always read this thick rule book and read these detailed cards. Sometimes it's, hey, we're going to act out a story, and you're going to help tell it. There was another hand in the back with something awesome. Where was that hand? There was something awesome. Here comes the mic.
Just going back to that corporate space a little bit, I work for an insurance company, and we have,
So I attacked you. Great.
exactly. We have those.
I actually knew that ahead of time. I had everyone fill out a little form. I'm like, I will
I'm gonna
offend
touch on
everyone
this and this.
at some point in my talk, because I'm a former librarian, and that's our job. They say, if you can't find something to offend you, see a librarian.
So like I sit in on a lot of those corporate meetings where it's a bunch of blah 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 numbers. They have tried to incorporate some fun in there. They'll throw in like a Jeopardy or a Family Feud or something like that to kind of get us engaged. But I think the biggest piece that's missing is that whole reflection category, right? You go through this, everyone's having a great time. Yeah, we're answering questions. Then we leave, go back to our desk, and we're back to work. So I think that reflection period for me was the biggest. Oh yeah, like that. It's such a simple concept, yet it's, I think, often overlooked because maybe it is so simple that people just don't think about it. But that's kind of what I was going to say.
In general, the rule of thumb is that I like to make sure we dedicate a third of any time in game playing to reflection. So if you have an hour, your game should be 40 minutes, and you should have 20 minutes for reflection. And that's how important that is. Because here's the trick about reflection. Reflection can make a bad game into a good learning experience. So even if the game you play isn't good, the fact that then you can reflect about why that was bad makes it a good learning experience. So it sort of saves your bacon in case you've got a game that kind of flubs, you can reflect upon it. Even Monopoly? I mean, including Monopoly. Eddie. Actually, the reason why I know Eddie's name,
Hi, Scott.
Embarrass him. This is one of my game design students. He's going to change the world.
Yeah, sure. Actually, so what we were talking about a little bit here, and to sort of build on what you were just saying, is a lot of companies, like I used to work for Staples, and they have morning rallies where they sort of talk about like all the metrics that you're trying to meet, and they sort of build in these like contests and stuff, and they'll, like you said, they also repurpose existing games like Jeopardy and stuff like that, and you already know all the answers, because they always talk about the same metrics. So they're like, so what are we trying to sell a lot of? And like everyone says the same thing, and you don't learn anything from it. Even with the terrible attempt at gamification, you've learned nothing. right? So like it's not even, what they're doing isn't even remotely effective, and no one is engaged anyway, and it just sort of builds even more animosity, and like the lower level employees are just even more convinced that their managers are totally out in space, right? So that's, I guess I can also sort of work this into a question towards you, because your office hours aren't until next week.
That's right.
But
That's the problem with social media. Your office hours are always.
how would you suggest going about sort of pushing a company away from the very easy and cheap method that does not work at all?
So the first thing you've got to do is assess it. And so that's where, as you learn, learning how to assess, did this actually work? Because that's what corporations will respond to, is be able to show, look, what you're doing doesn't work. Here's something to try, and then you can compare the two. And so it's idea of this user assessment. Again, we look to user experience design, how they're able to assess which of these things works most effectively. And so companies that are running on metrics and running on numbers, well, then you can do an A/B test where some people get one game, some people get another game, and you test the two. And if you have built, here's the trick on making that work. And I gave you the little trick already, but here's how to employ it. You're always thinking in every step of the design, how do I ensure that the test I'm going to give people is going to help them demonstrate what I'm having them do? And you're always thinking about that. You don't wait till the end and say, hey, let's just throw a survey in there and see if it makes a difference. You're actually thinking from the beginning, what's the change I want to demonstrate? And then you're building your games around how to make those changes. What other awesome stuff was talked about in your groups?
Just to build on that,
Yep.
I'm actually an instructional designer.
Uh-oh.
So,
actually, you probably saw a lot of what
I
your
actually
life
saw
and
a
what
lot.
I...
So actually,
yeah.
the reality is that a lot of the companies don't use instructional designers. They
Right.
don't use game designers. So or else you get junk. And we were having a discussion and saying that, I'm trying to change the mindset in the places that I'm working at. And the problem is that when people also, when they read things in the in sort of, say, general newspapers and so on, they hear the word gamification, they bring back that to, the work environment, say, oh yeah, we got to do gamification. Okay, do you actually know what that means? And then I have to go re-educate them in terms of what game-based learning is, and then what is gamification, and why gamification will work. Because they have stars in their eyes and say, yeah, we can actually do this. No, you cannot. In terms of there's all sorts of cultural issues, all sorts of work issues, and how do you get that sweet spot? The sweet spot in terms of how you get people to learn and how you balance the game mechanics to get that intrinsic motivation to actually get that change in behavior on the job, and that's where it gets tricky. And I think that's something that I think in terms of the people in this room, if you just sort of think about that,
Yep.
balance it with the right team of people who actually know how to change people's behavior in terms of training, that's where you're going to impact and get rid of the crummy Family Feuds and Jeopardy games, please.
Yes, you all are the ones that can make this change happen. Because you, as your passion, as your hobby, it's a Friday night. You're in the big city of Toronto, and you came here to talk about making games. This is something you're passionate about. This is something you have a lot of knowledge about, and you care about. And there are places that need your help. So one of my goals for tonight were to really, one, encourage you to take a look at your own designs, even if they're recreational, and say, is there something I could stick in there that could actually make a difference for players after they play my recreational game? Could they actually learn something? And a key part of doing that is making sure there's reflection in there so they get to realize what it is they've learned. Two, to open up your eyes to the organizational opportunities that are out there for the games we're making, for what we're exploring tonight. And while you're playtesting games, the question I always ask my students after they play every game that's assigned to them is I say, what's a real-world context you could take this game and apply it to? Bring that up as a playtester or a designer. Get people thinking, because you may be surprised to hear from someone who says, well, I work in the auto industry, and this would be really useful in teaching blah. And then your main contact in those industries are the people that are already doing training, because they're frustrated. They're trying to do this stuff. They know they're showing up with Jeopardy because that's all they've got. And you could show up with better tools and consult and get paid to consult and watch. Now, the sad part about that is that realize that means some of your games will disappear because they will, if you work with an organization, many times they will say, yes, you're going to give us the rights to that game. and they will sort of disappear into the organization. That's where a lot of my game designs have gone, into organizations. But on the other hand, I'm much better paid doing that than I am with my recreational board games. So you have to make that choice. And so I try to do both. So I have some things that make money and some things that get out there for people to play. So if you want to learn more about the degree program, if you have 17, 16-year-olds that you want to send to come and help us change the world through games, there's these things over on the promo stuff. If you want to learn more about anything I've talked about, everything I talked about tonight is supported by, because I'm an academic, and therefore I write all these papers. There's about 30 papers at BGNlab.ca. That's the BGNlab, the BGNlab.ca. There's a little link that says publications and presentations. You'll see my TEDx talk. You'll see lots of papers. They're all there for free. They give you the theory behind all this stuff I've talked about. Everything there you'll find in one of those papers. It'll give you guides. I've even got a paper on how to build reflection into any game. And so this is something I've been studying. I'm going to continue to write this stuff. So if you follow me on social media, Facebook or Twitter, you'll be able to keep up with all this crazy stuff. And next time, well, maybe I'll lock you all up in a room and see if you can figure out your way out of that. So thank you very much for listening to me. Now go out and change the world.